In history, there is a cruel theme whereby a place that has experienced periods of greatness and grandeur is condemned to go through times that are characterized by desolation and despair. Isfahan, the historic city in Iran, is a great example of that. Its story is filled with both peaks and valleys. From being pillaged and destroyed by Asian steppe hordes, to having this Persian proverb dedicated to it, Isfahan Nesfi Jahan ast. Isfahan is half of the world. In the process, it has left behind a rich, vibrant legacy that is accentuated by the numerous magnificent works of architecture throughout the city. The origins of the city were most likely militaristic, and the meaning of the name is probably something akin to place of the army. Before there was Isfahan, there was a small town called Jay, which had a Jewish settlement near it called Yahudiya. Now over time, Jay's population decreased whilst Yahudiya's increased, and it was this that eventually formed what would be the basis of Isfahan. The city would only come into its own after Islam's arrival to the area. Starting off in the 10th century, Isfahan began to show signs that it would become a prominent center in Persia. This started under the auspices of the Persian Buyid dynasty. During this time, many prominent scholars called Isfahan their home, including Ibn Sina or Avicenna for a few years. Isfahan's first significant chapter would come in the second half of the 11th century, when it was ruled by the Turkic Seljuk dynasty. Although this was a short-lived period, since it was undermined by the successive assassinations of the Sultan Malik Shah and his vizier Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuks still left a rich legacy which was underpinned by their architectural achievements. The most famous example of which is the Masjid-i Jami, and they popularized new architectural techniques such as the Iwan, which you see at the gates of so many Persian monuments that came after them. So it was in this period that Isfahan really started to get the feel of an imperial capital. The population started to increase, poetry flourished, and Persian started to be used in a major way in the Seljuk court. But the ebb and flow of history demanded that Isfahan experience some hardships after its period of prominence. Unfortunately for Isfahan, these hardships came in the form of the most destructive force of the medieval period. Like most of Asia, Isfahan was shocked by the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. When the Mongols went on their legendary run of conquests, Isfahan was one of the victims of their infamous tactic of putting a city to the sword. In fact, Isfahan's massacre was described by the medieval historian Rashid al-Din Hamadani as a massacre like none other. But the Mongol invasions did bring about a regeneration of sorts in the Silk Road, and the later Ilkhanat, the offshoot of the Mongols in Persia and the Middle East, worked on rebuilding their domain. Isfahan once again became a center of craftsmanship. It was even able to attract the famous 14th century poet Hafiz. In spite of these promising signs, the mark of Mongol devastation still remained in the city. In 1327, the traveller Ibn Battuta remarked that the city of Isfahan is one of the largest and fairest of cities, but it is now in ruins for the greater part. Before the city could claim its golden age, it would have to survive an existential threat in the form of another steppe conqueror that loomed on the horizon: Timur. Known in the west as Tamerlane, he seemed fixated on trying to conquer lands previously held by the great Mongol Empire. In this quest, Timur ravaged cities, much like his Mongol predecessors had done so. And fortunately for Isfahan, it too would fall victim to Timur's ruthless and clinical efficiency. He would go on to murder a vast portion of the city's inhabitants, with estimates going up to 70,000 after his tax collectors were killed by an angry mob in the city. Despite being the most glorious chapter of the city's history, the Safavid period started pretty ominously, when more than 5,000 Sunnis were reportedly killed in retaliation for the previous dynasty's anti-Shia policies. The Safavids were the ones who would ensure that Persia would go from being a Sunni stronghold to a unanimously Shia state. But the turbulent start to the relationship between the Safavids and Isfahan was eclipsed by Shah Abbas I. He turned it into one of the preeminent cities in the world when he made it his capital in 1598. It's not tough to see why it was made the capital. It has good water supply via the nearby Zayanda Rud River. It is more inland, therefore it offers greater protection than the previous Safavid capitals, Tabriz or Qazvin, could from the incessant danger of Ottoman incursions. And it is closer to the Persian Gulf, which Shah Abbas wanted to make greater commercial use of. The Safavid legacy in the city can be witnessed from the huge architectural projects that it completed. These were initially given impetus by the Maidani Naqshi Jahan, which is like the square in the center of the city that could have been the scene for communal celebration or leisure, strange games like wolf baiting, bullfighting, and ram fighting. There would be coffee houses flanking the square, or if you wanted something less straight edge, you could walk to the old Maidan Square and there you could find establishments which served a drink called koknar, that is made from the juice of an opium poppy. And there were plenty of other monumental constructions that followed: the Siuser Bridge, Masjid-i Shah, Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque, the Ali Kapur Palace, the Chehel Sultan Palace. These are incredible monuments. During its heydays in the 17th century, Isfahan was one of the biggest cities in the world. It was one that hosted a wide variety of ethnicities such as Jews, Georgians, European travelers or merchants, and even Indians. New Julfa, the Armenian quarter of Isfahan, had up to 30,000 people living in it by the end of the 17th century. But the good times could only last for so long, and so it would be that Isfahan's downfall was as spectacular as its rise. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Safavid Empire was in ruins, and an awful famine killed tens of thousands of the city's civilians. The famine caused the price of bread to skyrocket and led to severe discontent among the inhabitants, which naturally led to a rise in crime. It is said that things were so bad that the poor would have to strip the flesh of any dead camel, mule, or horse left out on the street. In the midst of all of this, the Afghans, driven by a burgeoning sense of self and national identity, had chased the Safavids out of Afghanistan and into Persia. They now stood at the doors of Isfahan, After a 6-month-long siege, the city fell to the Afghans, and Isfahan would never again recapture its past glory. During the 19th century, the Qajar dynasty was able to establish some stability after a chaotic 18th century. This meant moving their capital away from Isfahan, but the city still had its fertile land to ensure a resurgence of its status as a center of international trade through cash crops like opium or cotton in the aftermath of the American Civil War. In the 20th century, Isfahan, like most of Iran, which officially changed its name in 1935, benefited greatly from the Pahlavi dynasty's quest for modernization and industrialization. It became known as the Manchester of Persia for the development it experienced in its textile industry. The city has also continued its resurgence after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and it has grown tremendously in terms of size and population. Part of this was fueled by migrants who tried to escape the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s. And it's important to point out that the city's need to grow has raised concerns regarding the preservation of its past, with some historical buildings having been removed to make way for new developmental plans. More than anything, Isfahan's past is an excellent example of the ebb and flow of history, the peaks and valleys we spoke about at the beginning. Too often, we are persuaded to believe that the cycle we live in right now is going to exist forever. Especially in the West, where, despite the hardships of 2020, society at large is experiencing a degree of prosperity and opportunity that has rarely been seen in history. And so it's really important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the future and the potential hardships that it might hold. Think about it. If you are living in Malik Shah's Isfahan in the second half of the 11th century, why would you think that the good times are ever going to end? But did they end? Of course they did. There was a massacre, there was another massacre, there were famines, there was instability, there was chaos. Similarly, if you're living during Shah Abbas's time in Isfahan, why would you think that the good times are going to end? This is why it's important to use historical perspective in order to guide or at least inform some of our future decisions. As usual, I want to thank my Patreons for their generous support. It means a lot to me. Thank you guys. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, peace.